On a serene Friday morning, Mrs. Harris, a meticulous gardener known for her high standards in the neighborhood, was tending to her vibrant flower beds. She prided herself on maintaining the tranquility of her surroundings and often observed newcomers with a watchful eye. That morning, her attention was drawn to an unexpected sight: a moving truck parked across the street in front of the old, long-vacant house. Curiosity piqued, Mrs. Harris paused, wiping her hands on her gardening apron as two movers began unloading furniture. Her gaze sharpened when a tall, muscular African-American man stepped out of a sleek, black SUV that had pulled up behind the truck. The stranger's confident demeanor seemed to unsettle her. Who was he, moving into their peaceful neighborhood without a word of introduction? Mrs. Harris's unease grew as she watched him direct the movers with calm authority. Muttering under her breath, she retreated indoors, determined to investigate further. Something, she thought, didn't feel quite right. Feeling increasingly uneasy, Mrs. Harris decided to take matters into her own hands. She rummaged through her closet, retrieving an old pair of binoculars that had been collecting dust on the top shelf. Settling behind the curtains of her living room window, she peered out, carefully observing the man across the street. For nearly an hour she scrutinized his every move. He directed the movers with calm authority, arranging furniture methodically and carrying himself with a steady confidence. There was nothing overtly alarming about his actions, yet Mrs. Harris couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. Her mind raced with questions as she continued to watch, searching for any hint of wrongdoing. However, all she saw was a man focused on settling into his new home. Despite the lack of evidence to justify her unease, her suspicion only grew, fueling her resolve to act on the situation. Something, she convinced herself, must be amiss. As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Harris found herself unable to quell her growing unease. Every passing moment seemed to deepen her conviction that the stranger across the street didn't belong. Pacing her living room, she muttered to herself, replaying every detail she had observed, though none offered a clear reason for her discomfort. The man's calm, authoritative demeanor only unsettled her further, feeding her suspicion. Finally, unable to shake her concerns, Mrs. Harris reached for her phone. After hesitating briefly, she dialed the police. "Yes, I'd like to report some suspicious activity at the old Carter house," she said, her voice laced with feigned worry. "There's a man moving in and, well, I don't think he belongs here. He might cause trouble." On the other end, the dispatcher listened patiently, though the weariness in her tone was apparent. "All right, ma'am," she replied after taking down the details. "We'll send someone over to check it out." Mrs. Harris hung up, a wave of satisfaction washing over her. In her mind, she wasn't overreacting, but rather performing her duty as a vigilant neighbor. Settling into her armchair with a steaming cup of coffee, she waited for the officers to arrive, convinced she had taken the right step to protect her community. What she didn't anticipate, however, was just how wrong her assumptions would soon prove to be. It wasn't long before a police car pulled up in front of Mrs. Harris's house. The sight of the two officers stepping out filled her with a sense of validation. She hurried to her porch, a self-satisfied smile on her face, feeling certain she had done the right thing to safeguard her neighborhood. The officers, Thomas and Marcus, were seasoned veterans familiar with small-town calls like these. Tom, a stocky man with a rugged appearance, adjusted his belt as he surveyed the quiet street. Marcus, lean and sharp-eyed, scanned the surroundings with practiced precision. They exchanged a brief glance, silently acknowledging the likely nature of this call, one driven more by fear of change than any real threat. Mrs. Harris wasted no time greeting them. "Thank you for coming, gentlemen," she said, shaking their hands firmly. Her tone carried an air of urgency, as if her concerns were critical to maintaining the peace. "You know, we can't just let strangers move in and disrupt the harmony around here." Thomas nodded politely, his expression calm yet familiar with such situations. "Of course, Mrs. Harris. What seems to be the issue?" Lowering her voice as though sharing a secret, she pointed across the street. "That man over there just moved in today. I've never seen him before, and I have a strong feeling he's going to cause trouble." The officers exchanged another quick look, with Thomas raising an eyebrow slightly. "All right, ma'am. he replied evenly. "We'll go over and have a chat, just to make sure everything's in order." Pleased with their response, Mrs. Harris eagerly followed as they crossed the street, confident she had done her part to protect her neighborhood from what she perceived as an unwelcome presence. As the officers approached the front yard, the man Mrs. Harris had been so suspicious of stepped out onto the porch. His movements were steady and confident, his expression calm but curious at the sight of the police. Without hesitation, he stepped forward to greet them, extending a hand with a polite smile. "Good afternoon, officers," he said warmly. "How can I help you?" Thomas returned the handshake and spoke evenly. "Good afternoon, sir. We received a call from a neighbor and just wanted to check in. We understand you just moved in today." The man nodded, his expression remaining friendly yet composed. "That's correct. My name is Adrian Parker," he replied, his voice steady and assured. For a moment both officers blinked in surprise as recognition dawned. "Chief Parker?" Marcus asked, astonished. Gabriel Kingston gave a slight nod, a small smile forming. "That's right, I just arrived and am settling in before starting officially next week." Behind them, Mrs. Harris stood frozen, her face paling as she realized the gravity of her mistake. Her earlier confidence dissolved into shock, leaving her fumbling for words as her assumptions unraveled before her eyes. Gabriel turned his attention toward Mrs. Harris, who stood awkwardly a few steps behind the officers, her confidence now replaced by visible discomfort. His expression remained calm, but there was a hint of disappointment in his eyes. Taking a measured breath, he addressed her directly, his tone steady but firm. "Mrs. Harris," Gabriel began, meeting her gaze, "I understand that you're concerned about the safety of our neighborhood. That's something I take very seriously as well. But I must admit, I'm disappointed that your concerns led to this misunderstanding." Mrs. Harris's face flushed with embarrassment as she fidgeted, unable to find the right words to respond. Gabriel continued, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "In the future, if you have any issues or questions, I would prefer that you come to me directly. Open communication is important, and it helps us avoid unnecessary situations like this." The weight of his words settled heavily on Mrs. Harris. Her earlier confidence had been replaced by regret, and she could only mumble a soft, "Yes, of course," her eyes fixed on the ground. Gabriel's demeanor remained composed, but the subtle disappointment in his tone made her feel smaller than she ever had before. The two officers, standing nearby, exchanged a knowing glance. Gabriel's calm yet firm response had been far more effective than anything they could have said. "Chief Parker here has an excellent reputation," Thomas added, breaking the silence. "We're lucky to have him in our community." Mrs. Harris nodded hastily, her wounded pride evident. Without another word, she turned and hurried back to her house, the sting of humiliation lingering with every step. Overwhelmed with embarrassment, Mrs. Harris stood frozen for a moment, her earlier confidence shattered. Gabriel's calm yet firm words had struck a chord, leaving her to grapple with the uncomfortable truth of her actions. The realization of her own prejudice weighed heavily on her, and the smug satisfaction she'd felt earlier had completely evaporated. Her face flushed with humiliation as she avoided Gabriel's gaze, her eyes fixed firmly on the ground. Unable to muster a coherent response, she mumbled a faint apology before retreating toward her house. Each step felt heavier than the last, the sting of regret pressing down on her as she replayed the events in her mind. Once inside, Mrs. Harris shut the door behind her, leaning against it for support. The stark reality of what had just transpired left her feeling small and deeply ashamed. What she had believed was an act of vigilance had instead revealed her biases, a realization that would linger long after the moment had passed. As the officers returned to their patrol car, they exchanged an amused glance. "Chief Parker sure knows how to handle people," Marcus said with a quiet chuckle. Thomas nodded in agreement. "That's leadership in action." Meanwhile, Gabriel stood on his porch, watching them leave. He glanced briefly at Mrs. Harris's house, a small, knowing smile forming on his face. Despite the encounter, he remained composed, embodying the grace and professionalism that defined his character. The story ends with a poignant reminder about the importance of confronting prejudice and embracing fairness. Gabriel's calm demeanor and integrity serve as a powerful example of how understanding and professionalism can diffuse tense situations. Mrs. Harris's experience highlights the need for self-reflection and the harm caused by preconceived notions. The encounter ultimately leaves a lasting message. True community is built on respect, open communication, and the courage to challenge biases for the betterment of everyone.